Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Srinivasan, and welcome to the Internet of Everything track, specifically one on connected cars, cities, and homes. And I want to welcome everybody to our specific thought leadership on that subject. It's about IoT-enabled smart mobility, so the hyper reality. And I'd like to kind of present our view on the subject, and I'd love to get the audience questions at the end of the presentation. Just to give you a snapshot, Bamboo Cluster is an 18-month-old company. We are primarily focused on small to medium-sized businesses. We're starting to tiptoe into the public sector and starting to see some thought leadership in the area. Specifically around smart mobility. Just some housekeeping. I'm going to speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then if you have questions, please note them down, and I will address them at the end of the presentation. If you think something needs an answer immediately, feel free to post the question in the question box, Q&A box. So I'm just going to walk through the roadmap for this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, and kind of walk you through the presentation as we go through the rest of the slides today. So here's the roadmap for today. First thing is we're going to talk about smart mobility and what is smart mobility and why do we need it. Next, I'm going to talk about business, social, and technology challenges around smart mobility. And then I want to segue into some of the enablers of smart mobility, the IoT devices, technologies, platforms, solutions, and services. I don't anticipate going into gory detail here, but I just want to give you a bird's eye view of what we think are the enablers for smart mobility and some of the vendors who are bringing it to the marketplace. And then I'm going to leave you with three things. One is our point of view around an integrated approach to IoT-enabled smart mobility. Our first thinking around an architectural framework, how we can start to think about architectures that could enable IoT-enabled smart mobility. And then I'm going to leave you with a very simple use case around smart mobility. It's a fairly simple use case, which I think can be implemented even today. So I think we want to leave you with three things by the time we're done with our presentation this afternoon and evening. So I think we want to go into the first part of our presentation. What is smart mobility and why do we need it? I think the nature of urban mobility has been undergoing some tremendous change. Traditionally, urban mobility has been about moving people from one location to another location or between urban areas. I think that's what urban mobility has been. And people need urban mobility to access jobs, housing, urban services, whether it's for entertainment or education. And people preferred motorized mobility to non-motorized mobility because it's far more efficient than the non-motorized version. And especially as cities began to grow and societies became more affluent, I think people had the opportunity to have motorized ways of getting from point A to point B. But I think things are starting to change. Today, urban mobility is no longer just about moving people around by motorized vehicles. I think it's more about accessibility to various urban services, whether they be education, whether they be access to government services, whether it be access to public resources like parks. And there's a need to build and deploy a safe and sustainable transportation solution. I think that's where we're going towards today. I mean, yesterday it was just about moving people from point A to point B, but today it's become more about building out a safe and sustainable way of getting people from point A to point B. I think trends across the world are kind of pointing towards cities, especially heavily urbanized areas are kind of going to be the norm as opposed to the exception. The thing is, urbanization is around 30%. I mean, that's the percent of the population living in urban areas were around 30% around 1970. By the middle of this century, we anticipate that to be nearly 66%. I think urbanization is going to add to urban traffic, loss of productivity that's engendered by getting stuck in traffic and not being able to get from point A to point B to do what you need to get done. And ultimately, it leads to lower quality of life. So I think the trend towards urbanization is just moving forward. I think we expect nearly by the middle of the century, nearly 2/3 of the population around the world are going to be living in urban areas, or more likely to be big or medium-sized cities. I think that trend is going to continue for quite a while. So one of the key side effects of increased mobility through motorized transport is traffic gridlock, and I think most of us can attest to that in one way or the other. I would suspect that every one of us has been in a traffic gridlock at some point in our lifetimes. Just to give you some headlines around how is that manifesting itself in terms of loss of productivity. Just for example, in Manhattan, primarily drivers around the New York City area spent nearly 91 hours in traffic in 2016. And then U.S. drivers, it cost them nearly $300 billion last year. It's about averaging to about $1,400 per driver. So if you commute back and forth to work, I think there's a significant chance that there's a tremendous loss of productivity by traffic gridlock and sitting in traffic and essentially an unproductive use of your time. Similar statistics from the UK. There were nearly 32 hours a year that people are stuck during peak periods. That nearly cost nearly $31 billion last year in terms of lost productivity. That leads to an average of about 968 pounds per driver. So I think the evidence is there that motorized transport has become inefficient, and there is a need to look at far more efficient solutions to drive mobility. That is essentially moving people from point A to point B. City and both departments of transportation around cities and towns, they've implemented numerous projects, widening of roads, rapid transit systems like metros, but I think they're still finding that varied levels of success around these initiatives, but they're not been sustainable over time. So I think there's a radical rethink required as to how we start looking at urban mobility. So I think cities are beginning to recognize that there is a problem. They are starting to invest in sensors and leveraging information and communication technologies to solve congestion problems. And what this slide tends to show you is that cities are making significant investments so as to alleviate some of the issues around congestion and traffic gridlock, and essentially making sure that they're doing whatever enablers they can put in place to help mobility. For example, so Oslo, for example, has started rolling out smart LED lighting and has launched a broad sensing network for monitoring traffic levels and parking spaces. So I think there's a holistic way of looking at how do we manage traffic at a city level. And Oslo has been kind of one of the leaders in kind of implementing solutions in that context. Singapore, which actually really requires significant investments in traffic management, given that the land mass is so small, and has implemented congestion charging, which is essentially that if you enter the city center between the rush hour, you are essentially charged a higher toll rate than as opposed to when you enter the city center at a different time during the day. So I think the cities have become very innovative in terms of approaches as to what can be done to help alleviate some of the problems with urban mobility. So I think the steps are in the right direction, but I think both cities around the world are looking for solutions around how they can help manage the urban mobility problem. Back in 2015, the U.S. Department of Transportation launched the Smart City Challenge. I think this is one of the forward-thinking efforts out in the world here. So they launched a challenge in December of 2015, and they primarily asked mid-sized cities across the U.S. To come up with some ideas around an integrated approach to smarter transportation systems. That would essentially kind of give you some solutions around how do we alleviate traffic congestion, gridlock. And the DOT received over 78 responses from cities across the U.S. I think this is one of the most comprehensive programs ever undertaken by DOT. They shortlisted 7 across the U.S. Austin, and I don't know how San Francisco made the list as a mid-sized city, but I think we'll let it pass for now. And in early 2017, Columbus, Ohio was chosen as the winner. So I think there's some very significant initiatives being undertaken across the world, and more specifically in the U.S., to understand the problems engendered by mobility and how can we come up with some ideas for a smart transportation model. So I just wanted to kind of give you perspective on what's happening around the world and why there's a need for smart mobility. And I'm not going to get into a definition of smart mobility. It's essentially mobility that's enabled by technology, but it also has to be safe and sustainable in terms of a mobility model. So I think there's enough effort underway across the world in terms of trying to figure out to solve the urban transportation problem. Well, having said that, and having said what has been happening around the world from a public policy and from governments, both federal and city governments, I think private investment has actually been spurring some very interesting models around smarter transportation. I think these names might be quite familiar to people on the call. I think there's been quite a bit of investment, not just in motorized transport, but also in non-motorized transport. I think case in point here being City Bike, which is the bike sharing program across Manhattan and Brooklyn. And so I think people are starting to look at very innovative approaches, not just around private transportation also. For example, Chariot, which is about solving the commuting problem. I think they started off in Los Angeles, and I think they're starting to expand into multiple cities now. So folks like obviously Uber, which has been in the news in more ways than one. Zipcar, which is essentially sharing a car on demand. Chariot around solving the smarter commuting problem, and City Bike around a bike sharing program. So I think we are starting to see enough investment coming from the private sector to go after the smarter transportation issue. And we are starting to see actual investment and startups addressing the space in a fairly aggressive manner. And there's been a significant approaches both from the venture capital community and from city governments in investing in some of these technologies and also programs to help alleviate the transportation problem. I think these are some of the headlines here. I mean, I'm sure a lot of cities across the world are embarking on lesser known initiatives, but I think these are the ones which have managed to garner press and media attention in terms of innovative approaches to solving the transportation problem. So I think that there is now enough evidence to the fact that the mobility can really benefit from investment, both from the public sector and the private sector. And those investments are starting to prove in terms of outcomes around the fundamental issue of moving people from point A to point B. So I think in response to the question I posed on the title slide, whether IoT-enabled smart mobility is a hyper-reality, I think we've answered part of the question here. I think it's definitely people are investing in smart mobility solutions, and I think they are more than eager to embrace technologies, both from an information technology and from the communication side, to enable smarter transportation solutions. So I just wanted to kind of present a little panoply of approaches that have been taken both by cities and by the private sector. So that's kind of sets the backdrop for the rest of the discussion. And so I just wanted to kind of give you a perspective that smart mobility is here, and it's here to stay. And the question is, does IoT really help enable smart mobility? So I think this kind of summarizes what I've been saying over the last few slides. So investing in smart mobility has become an imperative. And I think to drive safe and efficient transportation approaches. So some of the analyst firms have already indicated some of these market sizes around that. We think it's going to be about a $150 billion industry by 2020. And so that represents a fairly significant market for potential vendors who want to enter the space. And I think smarter transportation and smarter mobility are definitely on the key market areas that many vendors across the world are pursuing very significantly and very aggressively. I think we want to kind of highlight some of the key features. What we think are the key features here. I think cities and towns want to get greater visibility into traffic flows to minimize the congestion at junctions and various points in the city. There's a need for better understanding of passenger demand patterns to make sure that you have enough capacity from a transportation standpoint to handle peaks and valleys. So we want to make sure that excess capacity is not provisioned so that it saves dollars and cents. And you want to reduce some inefficiencies in things around parking and payment systems. I think there are a number of mobile applications that have come up that can help you reduce efficiency in parking systems and also ensure smoother transactions by mobile payments. You also want to have an ability to coordinate data collection and the analysis of the same data across multiple transportation systems. So if you have a metro-based system and you have a bus-based transport system, I think it's important to understand what the implications are in terms of collecting the data and ensuring that you get a holistic view of the transportation fabric that's there at any point during the day. I think these are some of the kind of the key features we think are needed for intelligent transportation system. And I think the outcomes that we are looking for is it's going to be saving costs through an optimal resource allocation mechanism. There are environmental targets which can be achieved, and obviously the key outcome that people are looking for is to reduce transit time for citizens. I think that's kind of three major outcomes we think an intelligent transportation system needs to provide. And I think that's it's been one of those objectives for cities and towns across the world to see how they can achieve these things. However, IoT-enabled smart mobility faces a host of business, social, and technology challenges. Now, I've kind of assumed that IoT is going to be an enabler here. because we think that IoT is kind of an integral part of the technology fabric that's going to be needed to deploy smart mobility solutions. And we have made an hypothesis saying that IoT is going to be integral in terms of developing these solutions for the future. But city planners and transportation agencies across the world face a host of business, social, and technology challenges. A few things that we have highlighted here is around how do they align with the changing demographics of a city or a town or a village? How do they compete with other land use? Whether it's for housing, it's for economic infrastructure, for recreation. So how does that compete with those other requirements that you have for land? How do you make them accessible to the population? Obviously the advent of smartphones is going to make those things very kind of relatively easy, but you want to make sure it's accessible to the bulk of the population. Not everybody can afford a smartphone in every part of the world, so you also have to start thinking about how do you make this accessible. And one of the key problems has been how to deal with privacy and security challenges. Data privacy is going to be paramount here because most of smart mobility solutions require you to provide some degree of understanding of your location. So I think people have issues around how much they want to reveal about themselves. So data privacy and ensuring the security of the data fabric that's going to underlay these smart mobility solutions is going to be very, very important. And obviously the last thing is around how do you make them sustainable and friendly to the environment. I think that's going to be very key as we go forward. So these are some of the major business and social challenges we think smart mobility solutions are going to face. And I think those are fundamental to understanding how to solve those issues before we implement a smart mobility solution. So technology challenges has been the other side of the coin. And there's been quite a few challenges in terms of the ability to deploy a technology-centric smart mobility solution. One has been around the absolute lack of standardization to build, deploy, and manage IoT applications. So I think the standards are still in a very nascent stage. Standards are being formed, but I think they're in a state of flux as we speak, and there's a need to drive towards standards. The second challenge around technology has been high-speed data capture, management, and storage analysis capabilities. I think some of the popular platforms from Amazon and from Google are starting to look at how do you manage high-speed data capture management and the analytics on the data. So there have been some advances in terms of harnessing unstructured data and high volumes of data, so which is kind of needed to help enable a smart mobility solution. Endpoint devices are getting intelligent as we speak, but I think there's a way to go. They need to have sufficient computing horsepower for activations. I think that's we're starting to see greater levels of embedded intelligence as we speak. So, but it's in a state of flux. There is no consistency in managing end-to-end privacy and security of data in the system. So I think there needs to be a holistic view of how do you manage privacy and security of the data in the system. Remote devices. There are going to be devices which are going to be on their own. I think you need to have the ability to both update them and manage those capabilities so that you don't have to incur field service costs in kind of managing and harnessing those devices. And the last ones have been an integration platform. There are existing IT systems and applications, and how do we bring the data in the smart mobility solution? How do you integrate them with traditional IT systems? Has been a challenge going forward. I think these are some of the challenges that exist today, and it's not to say that they're going to be there moving forward, but we just want to bring to the table a few challenges that cities and governments need to look at as they start to implement smart mobility solutions. We thought we should at least try to provide a perspective on that. And what this slide is trying to tell you is that there are numerous challenges that have to be overcome while implementing smart mobility solutions. Now I want to go into enablers of smart mobility. I mean, everything around devices, technologies, platforms, solutions, and services. I don't want to go into gory detail here, but as you can see, the picture shows a whole smorgasbord of solutions and services and devices and technologies available. You have a multitude of vendors. I think you could name almost every technology vendor on the planet would have something related to an IoT device or a platform or a solution or an application. So it's really an alphabet soup of vendors, and I think this is going to be the norm at least for the next couple of years. We think that at least till toward the end of 2018, there is no emerging dominant ecosystem or provider in this space. We have folks, application vendors like SAP and Oracle at the top coming up with applications. You have silicon vendors like ARM and the rest of the vendor set in that space coming up with smarter silicon. Obviously, you have more fundamental platform elements like storage and servers, which many of the computing vendors have come up with in terms of offerings in that space. So our objective here was to kind of provide a perspective that the vendor space is so fragmented. There's multitude of technologies and platforms available. I think the key takeaway from this slide is, transportation departments of cities and towns, I think we'll need to find ways to make use of the whole smorgasbord of devices, technologies, platforms from multiple providers and sources, and you have to ensure that they're future-proof. And I think that requires a fair amount of due diligence and engagement with vendors to ensure that the investments you make today are likely to be relevant in the next decade or so. I think it's very difficult to do that, and I think vendors like us can help kind of delineate the technologies and the platforms available in the marketplace, and and directionally provide advice and counsel around what makes sense in terms of leveraging these technologies and platforms towards implementing smart mobility solutions. We did want to spend a few slides on a couple of these technologies, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to kind of give you a perspective. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the presentation on specific areas that people are looking for answers around, or specific technologies or platforms which are relevant for transportation. But I think we just wanted to give folks in the audience a little perspective on what we think the industry looks like today, and the vendor set that's typically ready to serve the transportation industry at this point in time. So that's our view in terms of the enablers of smart mobility. There is enough technology out there. There are enough number of platforms and approaches. I think a careful consideration of these technologies and even devices that you need to use for smart mobility solutions needs to be considered. And I think the important fact is that there is enough available technology infrastructure to implement smart mobility solutions. So having presented the previous slide, we want to move into the three things we wanted to talk about. One was, how do you take an integrated approach to smart mobility solutions? I think it's important to have a framework for why you want to implement a smart mobility solution. And at the same time, what are the objectives of that? How do you measure the effectiveness of your smart mobility solution? And what are the outcomes that you want to achieve? And I think those are the kind of the key key tenets of our approach that we are proposing. Again, this is our initial thinking, and we are happy to take questions and suggestions and critique on our approach. The objective was to present our thought leadership in this space and solicit suggestions and questions on the subject. So I know it's a busy slide, so I just want to kind of help kind of navigate this slide a little easier. So I think we start at the top, and I think we talk about why do you need smart mobility. So I think the key reason is that you want a people-centered transport system. It meets the diverse needs of the citizenry, and it's inclusive, and it kind of provides for a livable and vibrant city. I think that's kind of the key reason why cities and towns are driving towards smart mobility. So I think that's the fundamental thesis around why we want smart mobility. And so how do you differentiate? So how does a city differentiate itself in doing that? I think you want to provide best-in-class personalized multimodal transport experience. So what that means is that each mode of transport, the multimodal would be a bus, it'd be metros, it could be motorized vehicles like cars, both driven by people and autonomous vehicles. So you want to provide highly personalized multimodal transport experience, and that's how you differentiate yourself. And how do you measure that? I mean, I think there are three parameters or tenets we think are needed. One is around measuring your service effectiveness and providing metrics around that, and measuring efficiency around your transportation asset and infrastructure. It could be everything from your fleets of buses and metro and also infrastructure such as roads and bridges and lighting systems and the entire infrastructure that is needed to deploy a transportation system. And having metrics around traveler experience. One is around how happy are travelers with the transportation option in the city, and what are the metrics that you would typically need to measure travel experience in terms of satisfaction, in terms of timeliness, in terms of reduced transit times. So I think what we have provided here is a few metrics which are key. I mean, I'm sure there are other metrics which can be bring to the table, but I think what we have tried to do here is to try and identify those major metrics that a city or a town needs to look into if they want to measure the effectiveness of their smart mobility solution. And how do you achieve that? I think that's what we'll get into the next two slides. But I think what we are proposing is a cloud-based transportation-centric IoT platform. And that's an IoT platform which is highly customized towards transportation solutions, and I think that's kind of the key thing in terms of how IoT can enable your smart mobility solutions. And what are the typical outcomes that one would anticipate here? One, obviously, would be increased public transport modal share. What that means is people use more of public transport as opposed to private transportation. Obviously, it can go a long way in reducing congestion and gridlock in cities. You have a highly optimized usage of your assets and increased efficiency in terms of operational use of those assets. And obviously, the last outcome that people need are an enhanced customer travel experience. So I think these are the kinds of outcomes which cities and towns can look forward to in terms of what a smart mobility solution can achieve. And what we have tried to do here is try to simplify it on a one-page slide as to what we think an approach should be for architecting IoT-enabled smart mobility solutions. So this is our initial thinking, and we are happy to take questions. And you have my email on my first slide, and I'm happy to take suggestions and critique as to how we can improve or enhance our approach for smarter mobility solutions. So I think slide 12 is essentially a snapshot around that, and this is our current thinking on the subject. And we have tried to show it in pictures and in a single slide as to what an integrated approach looks like for a well-architected framework around IoT-enabled smart mobility solutions. So the framework is what I'm going to discuss in a couple of slides, and that's the part which is the whole gobbledygook around those funnels and those gears and nuts and bolts. I think that's the kind of we're trying to explain to you as to how we would architect a solution around that, and what are the characteristics of such a solution. And I think the next couple of slides I'm going to speak about how that solution comes about. So slide 12 was kind of our thinking in terms of the approach for smart mobility, and the subsequent slides I'm going to speak about how do we make that happen. Okay, this is a visual metaphor for what we think IoT can do. And we didn't want to get into the gobbledygook of the technology, but we just wanted to kind of have a visual representation of how this would actually work. So I think if you look at it, the whole nuts and bolts of system are essentially depicted by the two funnels, and then you have this conveyor belt with gears. This kind of a visual metaphor around how the mechanics of an IoT-based smart mobility solution would work. I mean, that essentially forms the core of the cloud-based IoT platform for transportation. And on the left-hand side of the slide, I mean, obviously we have a number of inputs around devices and sensors from across a multitude of transportation assets, from vehicles, from a whole range of entities that are engaged in the transportation system. And then you have the transportation assets. These are the assets that are essentially owned or leased by the city or state government, and an understanding of those assets. And obviously, you need to get understanding of the traveler base. And I think a set of inputs around that would be relevant. And then on the top, you're trying to get some intelligence and analytics around the transportation fabric that's happening, and that's kind of fed into the IoT-enabled platform. And then with a host of applications, these are the boxes in the red, you could then help drive towards a smart mobility solution. And what we've tried to identify is kind of the key capabilities and key applications that one would need to enable a smart mobility solution. And the outcome of that is this gauge on the end of the slide, on the right-hand side, which essentially is to drive better customer satisfaction and essentially drive a better travel experience. I think the key things we think are needed are things around traveler support. This is around enabling mobile applications and apps for travelers. Obviously, some applications around transit management, traffic management, emissions management, because the need to build sustainable and environmentally friendly solutions. Obviously, applications around emergency management, toll administration, especially if you want to drive congestion pricing, commercial vehicle administration. That's around essentially providing applications around managing a commercial vehicle fabric and a portfolio. And obviously applications around fleet and freight management, especially around if there is the transportation solution also has to consider commercial traffic in addition to passenger traffic. There's a need to understand the dynamics around some of the freight management issues in terms of moving goods from point A to point B. What we have tried to depict here is the fact that it's just not about movement of people. There's also a need to consider the movement of goods within cities. I think we started off with our assertion that smart mobility is about moving people from point A to point B, but mobility solutions also need to consider the movement of goods within a city and across cities. I think that's fundamental to understanding the smarter mobility issue in a broader context is just about moving people from point A to point B. So this is kind of the mechanics around how we think one should go about building a smart mobility solution. The boxology is more around trying to give you a picture of as to what are the things that need to be considered while building out a smart mobility solution. So this is kind of our visual metaphor around that, and obviously this is what we think is needed. I'm sure there are a few boxes here and there which we might have to consider, but I think this is our initial thinking on how an IoT-enabled platform should drive towards enabling a smart mobility solution. So I want to go back to this slide here, and I want to kind of show what the gear, all the visual metaphor around the two funnels and the gears looks like, and what is the architectural framework that drives that. And this is is a way for us to kind of depict as to what are the things you need and how IoT is integral to enabling that smart mobility solution. So if you look at the boxes in yellow, we think that's kind of the core building block of the IoT-enabled transportation platform, which is going to enable you a smart mobility solution. It would do things such as device management, connectivity, building the data model, and then you would have a few IoT services on top of that. I think you need everything from event processing to analytics. And obviously, you need certain developer services, essentially the developer services needed to integrate this platform with other applications, other IT systems. This is our representation as to what we would need typically from an IoT development platform, which sits above your IoT platform to build those services. And the boxes in gray correspond to the boxes in red on the other side, which is essentially the applications that you would need to enable a smart mobility solution. And this sits on top of a whole communications fabric. So you have both wired and wireless communications. And there's also need for a supervisory control and data acquisition, which is kind of a subsystem that would essentially feed into the IoT-based platform to drive communications between the applications and the devices and to the transport infrastructure. So there's a communication fabric that's needed. I think that can be instantiated using current networks or the emerging fifth generation networks from some of the major network vendors. But I think what we have tried to explain here is kind of a simple approach that can be taken to deploy a smart mobility solution. So this is essentially our thinking in terms of what an architectural framework should look like for a solution that enables smart mobility. It's our initial thinking, and we invite questions and feedback as we present it to the audience here and in the future. So this is our thinking in terms of an architectural framework. And we think this is kind of integral for cities and towns to consider in terms of what they need, in terms of capabilities, services, and applications and solutions when they go to deploy a smart mobility solution. So I think that's our thinking, and I think we wanted to present that and solicit feedback and critique. Finally, this is a simple use case around smart mobility. I don't think smart mobility solutions are necessarily don't always have to be complex. And I think there are fairly simple but fairly productive use cases that can be brought to the table. And the one that we have tried to depict here is around a smart bus travel planner using, obviously IoT, web, and mobile and NFC technologies. They all come into play at different points in the whole approach. So I just want to kind of walk through how these technologies come into play. IoT comes into play in a number of these sub-steps. But I just want to so I think somebody who wants to go from point A to point B typically looks up transit information on the web or on an app And I think an intelligent travel planner either could come up with certain commute recommendations and options, and that travel planner would then be enabled on a mobile device, so you could essentially figure out what commute option makes sense for you. So I think we have tried to explain that in the context of a person trying to get to taking a bus service from point A to point B. And then once you have certain recommendations from the application as to what makes sense, so once a commuter selects an option, I think the system uses GPS and the mobile phone to help coordinate a boarding process for that person, and that kind of helps you understand when the bus is expected at a certain point and a certain stop, and helps you navigate yourself to the bus stop at the right time. I think once on board, I think the mobile phone enables, using NFC can enable a ticketing technology, and I think the bus can be intelligent enough to provide the framework needed and the support needed for ticketing the passenger for the desired destination. I think what you're seeing is the user-facing part of the technology fabric. But what we want to present here is, I think there's an IoT-enabled platform that's underlying a smart bus travel planner, and especially around managing the sensors around the transport infrastructure provided by the bus system, and how IoT could be an enabler in terms of an application as simple as a smart bus travel planner. So as you can see, it's not a very complex application. What it is it's a way of deploying an application that's very friendly to the traveler, really helps the traveler in navigating the city or the town, and at the same time, it's an application that can drive better traveler experience. IoT is kind of the hidden technology working behind the scenes to help you enable a very simple application around that. And I think this is what we wanted to showcase, that I think the time is ready. Smart mobility is for real, and the use case is just to highlight that smart mobility doesn't necessarily have to be a very complex application. You can use a fairly simple use case to demonstrate the need for smart mobility, and a smart bus travel planner is kind of a very simple use case to highlight that. So I think that's all I wanted to speak about today, and I think I wanted to give you kind of our perspective on where smart mobility is. First, we wanted to answer the question, is it for real? And I think based on the evidence we presented at the beginning of the presentation and some of the initiatives that's been undertaken across the world, smart mobility is here to stay. We wanted to leave you with our approach for smart mobility, what we think cities and towns should use in terms of approach. We presented an architectural framework as how an IoT-enabled smart mobility solution should look like, and we showcased one of our simple use cases around smart mobility. With that, I think I'd like to invite questions from the audience, and like to start looking at questions. I think I have some questions already, which I'll look up, but I'd like to invite more questions from the audience as we speak. Okay. I have a question here. What are the barriers to smart mobility in your view? I think there are a number of public policy issues that come into play whenever you try to implement a smart mobility solution. I mean, let me just take the case of Uber, for example. And as many of you know, Uber has been engaged with a multitude of city governments. Typically, they go up against the taxi commission in a typical city, and I think public policy issues are one of the key barriers we think smart mobility is going to face. Uber has kind of been the holding the torch in terms of smart mobility solutions. They have had their fair share of the press in terms of their altercations with a multitude of city governments. I could say, case in point, in New York City, Uber has had a very choppy time in terms of establishing themselves. And Austin, Texas, where Uber has been essentially been asked to unwind itself, but I think there's a constant tussle between city governments and some of the smart mobility solutions. I mean, Uber is just a case in point. That's one. There are others. The other major issue that comes around is privacy. People are starting to get more sensitive about their privacy, and smarter mobility solutions require that you provide some understanding of your location. And I think people are reluctant to reveal much of their private information, especially when it comes to location. So privacy becomes a big issue because there is a constant need to know where you are, and I think if you have to implement a smart mobility solution, you need to assure the citizenry of privacy issues and how they're going to be addressed in terms of their in the usage of data, especially when it relates to privacy. The third barrier, I think, is around managing the whole technology infrastructure and application footprint to deploy a smart mobility solution. I think just dealing with the vendor set, there's a multitude of vendors. You need to bring together, at the very least, 5 to 6 vendors to deploy a solution. And it could be like herding cats, because I think each vendor is going to have their own way of implementing solutions, and then having a discipline around how to bring multiple vendors to the table in actually implementing the solution, I think is a non-trivial problem to solve. I think those are kind of the major barriers for smart mobility. But if you can show outcomes that enhance the traveler experience, so I think where the benefits significantly outweigh the challenges and the negatives, then there's a higher preponderance of the smart mobility solution being implemented. So I think those are some of the barriers that I can speak to right from the top of my head, and I think those, and then probably a few others, especially around managing expectations of the travelers. I mean, it's a logistics problem at the end of the day. How do you manage movement of people and goods from point A to point B, and ensuring that you manage expectations of the traveler population is key to the success of the mobility solution. So I think that's what I would characterize as some of the key barriers to smart mobility. Okay, so I think there's one more. Okay, let me rephrase the question here. So low-income populations will have many issues around access to a smart system due to income inequality. This is a system for educated middle to upper class users. Not necessarily. I mean, let me just mark this one. So I think I talked about one of the key challenges in terms of social challenges on one of my slides. And by the way, the slides are available in the attachments. So feel free to download them at your convenience. So I think this is a key problem. Well, it's like, do you need a smartphone? Do you need these high-end devices to take advantage of smart mobility? The answer is no. It is needed, but I think the solutions have to be I wouldn't say scaled down, but I think they need to take into consideration a multitude of travelers coming across varying demographics. And I think the important thing is to make available the solution through multitude of options. One is through possibly a personal device like a smartphone, but I think for example, in New York City, we have these smart kiosks coming up, springing right across the multiple boroughs, and providing access to transit information doesn't necessarily have to be personalized through a device, but should be accessible. I think accessibility is one of the key tenets we want to bring to the table in terms of our approach. I mean, it's a solution that should be accessible by multiple everybody from folks who can't afford a smartphone to somebody who could afford the most latest and greatest device out in the marketplace today. And that accessibility can be provided through a multitude of options, and just even simple text messages should be sufficient to provide up-to-date transit information for a person willing to take advantage of the public transportation system. So I think it should take advantage of some of the more, I would like to say up-to-date technologies, but I think it should be normalized enough so that the accessibility is an issue that is addressed as part of the design of the smart mobility solution. And I don't think it's a solution that just needs to be skewed towards a certain demographic, as it's as towards an educated middle to upper class. But I think the solution needs to take into consideration, potential parts of the demographic who can't necessarily afford, the latest and greatest in technologies in terms of personalized computing. So I think that's key here. I mean, the use case we just mentioned, it should be deployable over without a smartphone. I mean, I think the text messages on most handheld devices now have GPS embedded in them, and I think with the commoditization of technology, we are starting to see smarter and smarter devices at a lower cost point. So I think it's fairly reasonable to imagine that a device that is considered a high-end device today in the next 5 years may be quite mainstream. So I think we want to make sure the mobility solutions are accessible, and I don't think you have to depend on a specific technology or to access it. And I think that's kind of key in terms of the design point of the mobility solution that the city or a town needs to bring to the table here. So that's my answer towards that. I think most cities are conscious of that in terms of the varying demographic across the city, and actually are cognizant of how to make them available to multitude of people across the city. Obviously, some of the solutions, when they're initially implemented, may just be reachable or may just be accessible by a certain demographic of the population. But over time, I think the objective should be to make sure that it's universally accessible across the multiple demographics in a city or a town. So that's my answer to that. And I think we are almost at the top of the hour. And if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank everybody for being part of the summit, and specifically on this presentation on smart mobility and how IoT can potentially enable that. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a note. Our contact information is available on the slides. And when you get a chance, follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. There's one more question here, a couple of questions here. And if there's no more questions, I am going to